A godly woman finds out that her people are about to be destroyed, and it's up to her to save them.
Let's talk about that.
It's the year 489 BC, in Shushan, the capital of Medo-Persia. After a brief incident regarding Vashti, a party, and a disobeyed command, King Ahasuerus no longer has a wife. When she is banished from the king's house, his advisors come and suggest that the king should send out officers all over the country to find him a new queen. The king decides that this is an excellent idea and does exactly that. Many young and beautiful maidens were gathered from all around the country, one of whom was Esther, also known as Hadassah, the Jew, cousin of Mordecai, who sat at the king's gate. Esther was favored above all the women that had been found, and the king chose her to be his queen instead of Vashti. All this time, Esther had not told anyone that she was a Jew, because Mordecai had told her not to.
Shortly after this, we read of two men who wanted to take the king's life. Let's read a little excerpt which can be found in Esther 2:21-23. In those days, while Mordecai sat in the king's gate, two of the king's chamberlains, Bigthan and Teresh, of whom which kept the door, were wroth, and sought to lay hand on the king Ahasuerus. And the timing was known to Mordecai, who told it unto Esther the queen, and Esther certified the king thereof in Mordecai's name. And when inquisition was made of the matter, it was found out. Therefore they were both hanged on a tree, and it was written in the book of the Chronicles before the king.
Not long after, the king made a terrible decision. He promoted Haman the Agagite above all the princes. The king decreed that everyone must bow to Haman when he comes by, and of course, everyone did this. Well, everyone besides Mordecai, that is. It didn't take long for Haman to find out that Mordecai was a Jew. This caused Haman to develop a huge hatred for the Jews, and he tried to devise a plan to destroy them all. Haman succeeded and planned to ask the king for his approval.
Esther 3:8-14 tells us what the king decides. While I read this, keep in mind that he still didn't know that his wife was a Jew. And Haman said unto King Ahasuerus, There is a certain people scattered abroad and dispersed among the people in all the provinces of thy kingdom, and their laws are diverse from all people, neither keep they the king's laws. Therefore it is not for the king's profit to suffer them. If it please the king, let it be written that they may be destroyed, and I will pay 10,000 talents of silver to the hands of those that have the charge of the business, to bring it into the king's treasuries. And the king took his ring from his hand, and gave it unto Haman the son of Hammedatha the Agagite, the Jews' enemy. And the king said unto Haman, The silver is given to thee, the people also, to do with them as it seemeth good to thee. Then were the king's scribes called on the 13th day of the first month, and there was written according to all that Haman had commanded unto the king's lieutenants, and to the governors that were over every province, and to the rulers of every people of every province, according to the writing thereof, and to every people after their language in the name of King Ahasuerus was it written, and sealed with the king's ring. And the letters were sent by posts into all the king's provinces, to destroy, to kill, and to cause to perish, all Jews, both young and old, little children and women, in one day, even upon the 13th day of the 12th month, which is the month Adar, and to take the spoil of them for a prey. The copy of the writing for a commandment to be given in every province was published unto all people, that they should be ready against that day.
Mordecai heard of the plan, and mourned in sackcloth and ashes at the king's gate. When Esther heard of this, she sent some servants down to clothe him in good clothes and cheer him up. Mordecai refused to be cheered up, and told Esther's servants about the decree that condemned the Jews to death, and he pleaded with her to appeal to the king about it.
Now keep in mind that no one was allowed to enter the king's presence without being summoned, on pain of death. sent a message to Mordecai telling him about this law and how the king hadn't sent for her in a month. The danger was very great.
Now listen to how Mordecai responds in chapter 4, verses 13 and 14. Think not with thyself that thou shalt escape in the king's house more than all the Jews. For if thou altogether holdest thy peace at this time, then shall there enlargement and deliverance arise to the Jews from another place. But thou and thy father's house shall be destroyed. And who knoweth whether thou art come to the kingdom for such a time as this?
Esther agreed to do what Mordecai had asked, but requested something from him as well. Let's read verse 16. Go, gather together all the Jews that are present in Shushan, and fast ye for me, and neither eat nor drink 3 days, night or day. I also and my maidens will fast likewise, and so will I go in unto the king, which is not according to the law. And if I perish, I perish.
Then came the big moment. Esther went into the king's court. When the king saw this, she obtained favor in his sight, and he held out the golden scepter to her, which saved her life. Then he asked what she wanted. She asked for the most unusual thing, that the king and Haman attend a banquet.
Later at said banquet, the king asked Esther what she really wanted. He knew that she wouldn't have risked her life by coming into the court just to ask if he could come eat some good food with her. She answered by asking if they could come back to another banquet tomorrow, and told him that she would ask her real petition of him then.
Let's hear what Haman thought of this whole event. Chapter 5, 9 through 14 follows Haman after the banquet. Then went Haman forth that day, joyful and with a glad heart. But when Haman saw Mordecai in the king's gate, that he stood not up nor moved for him, he was full of indignation against Mordecai. Nevertheless, Haman refrained himself, and when he came home, he sent and called for his friends and Zeresh his wife. And Haman told them of the glory of his riches, and the multitude of his children, and all the things wherein the king had promoted him, and how he had advanced him above all the princes and servants of the king. Haman said moreover, Yea, Esther the queen did let no man come in with the king unto the banquet that she had prepared but myself. And tomorrow am I invited unto her also with the king. Yet all this availeth me nothing, so long as I see Mordecai the Jew sitting in the king's gate. Then said Zeresh his wife and all his friends unto him, Let a gallows be made 50 cubits high, and tomorrow speak thou unto the king, that Mordecai may be hanged thereon. Then go thou in merrily with the king unto the banquet. And the thing pleased Haman, and he caused the gallows to be made.
That night, the king couldn't sleep, so he called for his servants to bring the book of records of the Chronicles, thinking that the most boring book in the kingdom might put him to sleep. While it was being read to him, it was found that Mordecai had told of Bigthan and Teresh, 2 of the king's chamberlains who had sought to murder him. Let's read chapter 6, verses 3 through 13, to hear what happens next. And the king said, What honor and dignity hath been done to Mordecai for this? Then said the king's servants that ministered unto him, There is nothing done for him. And the king said, Who is in the court? Now Haman was come into the outward court of the king's house, to speak unto the king, to hang Mordecai on the gallows that he had prepared for him. And the king's servants said unto him, Behold, Haman standeth in the court. And the king said, Let him come in. So Haman came in. And the king said unto him, What shall be done unto the man whom the king delighteth to honor? Now Haman thought in his heart, To whom would the king delight to do honor more than to myself? And Haman answered the king, For the man whom the king delighteth to honor, let the royal apparel be brought which the king useth to wear, and the horse that the king rideth upon, and the crown royal which is set upon his head. And let this apparel and horse be delivered to the hand of one of the king's most noble princes, that they may array the man withal whom the king delighteth to honor, and bring him on horseback through the street of the city, and proclaim before him, Thus shall it be done to the man whom the king delighteth to honor. Then the king said to Haman, Make haste, and take the apparel and the horse, as thou hast said, and do even so to Mordecai, the Jew that sitteth at the king's gate. Let nothing fail of all thou hast spoken. Then took Haman the apparel and the horse, and arrayed Mordecai, and brought him on horseback through the street of the city, and proclaimed before him, Thus shall it be done unto the man whom the king delighteth to honor. And Mordecai came again to the king's gate. But Haman hastened to his house mourning, and having his head covered. And Haman told Zeresh his wife and all his friends everything that had befallen him. Then said his wise men and Zeresh his wife unto him, If Mordecai be of the seed of the Jews, before whom thou hast begun to fall, thou shalt not prevail against him, but shalt surely fall before him.
That is the most ironic part of the entire book. So here we have Haman coming in to ask the king if he can hang Mordecai on his newly built gallows. And just before he had the chance to ask, the king asked him what he thinks should be done to the one whom the king wants to honor. Then the king tells him to do it to the very man who Haman wants to hang. When we read of events like this, we can assume that God has a huge sense of humor. I can't help but laugh whenever I read it.
In the next chapter, the king and Haman attend the queen's second banquet. Chapter 7, verses 2 through 10 says, And the king said again unto Esther on the second day of the banquet of wine, What is thy petition, Queen Esther? And it shall be granted thee. And what is thy request? And it shall be performed, even to the half of the kingdom. Then Esther the queen answered and said, If I have found favor in thy sight, O king, and if it please the king, let my life be given me at my petition, and my people at my request. For we are sold, I and my people, to be destroyed, to be slain, and to perish. But if we had been sold for bondmen and bondwomen, I had held my tongue, although the enemy could not countervail the king's damage. Then the king Ahasuerus answered and said unto Esther the queen, Who is he, and where is he that durst presume in his heart to do so? And Esther said, The adversary and enemy is this wicked Haman. Then Haman was afraid before the king and the queen. And the king, arising from the banquet of wine in his wrath, went into the palace garden, and Haman stood up to make request for his life to Esther the queen, for he saw that there was evil determined against him by the king. Then the king returned out of the palace garden into the place of the banquet of wine, and Haman was fallen upon the bed whereupon Esther was. Then said the king, Will he force the queen also before me in the house? As the word went out of the king's mouth, they covered Haman's face. And Harbona, one of the chamberlains, said before the king, Behold also the gallows 50 cubits high, which Haman had made for Mordecai, who had spoken good for the king, standeth in the house of Haman. Then the king said, Hang him thereon. So they hanged Haman on the gallows that he had prepared for Mordecai. Then was the king's wrath pacified. After Haman died, King Ahasuerus promoted Mordecai into his position, and gave him his signet ring.
So that was the end of Haman, but what about the decree to kill the Jews? That still stood. They weren't safe yet. Let's read chapter 8, verses 3 to 17 to find out the rest of the story. And Esther spake yet again before the king, and fell down at his feet, and besought him with tears to put away the mischief of Haman the Agagite, and his device that he had devised against the Jews. Then the king held out the golden scepter toward Esther. So Esther arose, and stood before the king, and said, If it please the king, and if I have found favor in his sight, and the thing seem right before the king, and I be pleasing in his eyes, let it be written to reverse the letters devised by Haman the son of Hammedatha the Agagite, which he wrote to destroy the Jews, which are in the king's provinces. For how can I endure to see the evil that shall come unto my people? Or how can I endure to see the destruction of my kindred? Then the king Ahasuerus said unto Esther the queen, and to Mordecai the Jew, Behold, I have given Esther the house of Haman, and him they have hanged upon the gallows, because he laid his hand upon the Jews. Because of Esther's plea for help and Mordecai's wisdom, a new addition was made to the terrible law. This addition said that the Jews could defend themselves on the fateful day when everyone rose up against them.
We read of the Jews' victory on that fateful day, and the feasting which took place afterwards. Let's read it. Now in the 12th month, that is, the month of Adar, on the 13th day of the same, when the king's commandment and his decree drew near to be put in execution, in the day that the enemies of the Jews hoped to have power over them, though it was turned to the contrary, that the Jews had rule over them that hated them, the Jews gathered themselves together in their cities throughout all the provinces of King Ahasuerus, to lay hand on such as sought their hurt, and no man could withstand them, for the fear of them fell upon all people. And all the rulers of the provinces, and the lieutenants, and the deputies, and the officers of the king, helped the Jews because the fear of Mordecai fell upon them. For Mordecai was great in the king's house, and his fame went out throughout all the provinces. For this man Mordecai waxed greater and greater. Thus the Jews smote all their enemies with the stroke of the sword, and slaughter and destruction, and did what they would unto those that hated them. And in Shushan the palace the Jews slew and destroyed 500 men. And Parshandatha, and Dalphon, and Aspatha, and Paratha, and Adelia, and Aritha, and Paramashta, and Aridai, and Vajava, the 10 sons of Haman, the son of Hammedatha, the enemy of the Jews, slew they. But on the spoil laid they not their hand. On that day the number of those that were slain in Shushan the palace was brought before the king. And the king said unto Esther the queen, The Jews have slain and destroyed 500 men in Shushan the palace, and the 10 sons of Haman. What have they done in the rest of the king's provinces? Now what is thy petition, and it shall be granted thee? Or what is thy request further, and it shall be done? Then said Esther, If it please the king, let it be granted to the Jews which are in Shushan to do tomorrow also according unto this day's decree, and let Haman's 10 sons be hanged upon the gallows. And the king commanded it so to be done. And the decree was given at Shushan, and they hanged Haman's 10 sons. For the Jews that were in Shushan gathered themselves together on the 14th day also of the month Adar, and slew 300 men at Shushan. But on the prey they laid not their hand. But the other Jews that were in the king's provinces gathered themselves together, and stood for their lives, and had rest from their enemies, and slew of their foes 70 and 5,000, but they laid not their hands on the prey. On the 13th day of the month Adar, and on the 14th of the same, rested they, and made it a day of feasting and gladness. Therefore the Jews of the villages that dwelt in the unwalled towns made the 14th day of the month Adar a day of gladness and feasting, and a good day, and of sending portions one to another. And Mordecai wrote these things, and sent letters unto all the Jews that were in all the provinces of the king Ahasuerus, both nigh and far, to establish this among them, that they should keep the 14th day of the month Adar, and the 15th day of the same, yearly, as the days wherein the Jews rested from their enemies, and the month which was turned unto them from sorrow to joy, and from mourning into a good day, that they should make them days of feasting and joy, and of sending portions one to another, and gifts to the poor. And the Jews undertook to do as they had begun, and as Mordecai had written unto them, because Haman the son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, the enemy of all the Jews, had devised against the Jews to destroy them, and had cast pur, that is, the lot, to consume them, and to destroy them. But when Esther came before the king, he commanded by letters that his wicked device, which he devised against the Jews, should return upon his own head, and that he and his son should be hanged on the gallows. Wherefore they called these days Purim, after the name of Pur. Therefore, for all the words of this letter, and of that which they had seen concerning this matter, and which had come upon them, the Jews ordained, and took upon them, and upon their seed, and upon all such as joined themselves unto them, so as it should not fail that they would keep these 2 days according to their writing, and according to their appointed time, every year, and that these days should be remembered and kept throughout every generation, every family, every province, and every city, and that these days of Purim should not fail from among the Jews, nor the memorial of them perish from their seed. And Esther the queen, the daughter of Abihail and Mordecai the Jew, wrote with all authority to confirm this second letter of Purim. And he sent the letters unto all the Jews, to the 127 provinces of the kingdom of Ahasuerus, with words of peace and truth, to confirm these days of Purim in their times appointed, according as Mordecai the Jew and Esther the queen had enjoined them, and as they had decreed for themselves and for their seed the matters of the fastings and their cry. And the decree of Esther confirmed these matters of Purim, and it was written in the book.
Chapter 10 is only 3 verses long and gives a prologue. It tells how the king put a tax on the land and how great Mordecai was in the kingdom. It also refers to more great acts of Mordecai and how they can be found in the records of the Medes and the Persians.
In the last part of chapter 9, you may have noticed that Esther created a new feast that was to be celebrated yearly in honor of the day that was turned from mourning into joy. That feast is called Purim. You also may have noticed that we released this video on a Friday. We normally do so on Sunday. So why is this episode different? Well, that is because today is the actual Feast of Purim, according to the moon, and we wanted to release it on the actual day.
Before we move on to the different lessons we can learn from the book of Esther, let's talk a little more about Purim. These days, many Jews and Messianics celebrate this holiday by dressing up like Esther, Mordecai, the king, Haman, etc., and act out or read the book of Esther. Whenever Haman's name is mentioned, everyone boos and makes as much noise as they can to drown it out.
Boo!
Some do this by twirling noisemakers called a grogger. Some even have the tradition of writing Haman's name on the bottom of their shoes and stomping on it. Some food enjoyed on Purim includes triangular cookies that have jelly in the middle. These cookies are traditionally thought to be in the shape of Haman's hat and are called hamantashen.
Now let's look at what we can learn from the book of Esther. First, God always puts his people in the right place at the right time. It wasn't Esther's choice to be the king's wife, or even to be in Shushan at all, but God used it to save his people, Israel. That brings me to our second point. God has and always will have a plan to save Israel in accordance with his promise to Abraham. Third, Esther was ready to sacrifice her life for her people. We need to have that love for others. It is rare that people these days are willing to put themselves in danger to save another. Most people just look the other way to save their own skin. Esther went into the king's court uninvited. She could have been sentenced to death if the king had not shown mercy, but she did it anyway. Fourth, God is sovereign. His name is never mentioned in the book, but everything points to his sovereignty. Everything happens according to his will. Lastly, choices have consequences. Did you know that Haman was a descendant of the wicked king Agag, whom Saul was supposed to kill? Because Saul chose to save Agag the king, Haman was born, and because of him, the Jews were almost wiped off the face of the planet. Not only that, but Mordecai was descended from Mephibosheth, Jonathan's son. It's only because David kept his promise to Jonathan that Mephibosheth was even alive and cared for. Thus, here we have the final showdown, if you will, between Saul's family and the Agagites. This also helps explain why Haman hated the Jews as a whole and wanted them gone.
Because of the length of this episode, we have chosen to answer this week's questions at the end of next episode. Thanks so much to everyone who sent in their questions to Noah Cheese Stick. We've got some good ones to answer next time. If you would like to have your question answered on the show, please send it to noahcheesestick@gmail.com or submit it on the form that can be found on our website, animalmediaproductions.weebly.com, on the Weekly Word Shows page under the Released Videos tab.
Thanks for watching this special Purim episode of the Weekly Word Show. Please subscribe to us on YouTube, follow us on Google+, and check out our website at animalmediaproductions.weebly.com to find lots more content for kids and people of all ages.
Until next time, Kong Sameach, Shalom, and God bless.
Break.
All right, everybody, let's do this thing. On that fateful day, and the feasting which... That night, the king couldn't sleep, so he called for his servants to bring the book of the Cheez-It. The book of the Cheez-It!